Hi there everybody, this is Jamie Dunn on the Animotions team. I'm here to show you guys how to make a 2D graphic icon that we're going to be using in our shop when you purchase your masks. So I have an example here of one that I've made. This is the generic just boy mask, one of the default masks you can get in the app. And this is what the little icon looks like in the app. We're working in Photoshop today, so to start a new document, we're going to go to File, New, first option up there. You're going to switch your width to 600 and your height to 600 and make sure it's scaled in pixels. You don't want it to be scaled to like inches. Your image is going to be freakishly large if you start with inches. And then we're just going to lastly bump up our resolution to 300. And we'll be good to just hit create from there. All your other settings are good by default. So if we hit create, it's going to give us this new canvas right here. And looking at it, the only thing you're going to have over here in your layers panel is just this blank background. So one of the first things we're going to do, as you'll see, is add a new layer with this little plus button inside the square. But I'm actually going to dip on over because I already have a document set up that I've been working on some other masks. So this is the one I'm going to use today. I'm going to be working inside this mask 3 folder. Don't get confused with the mask 1 and mask 2 and some of these other layers I have here. Everything's going to stay inside mask 3 that I'm doing today. So what we're going to be working on today is we are going to make an icon for this model. This is the generic girl model that Finn Scown has been modeling. He also drew this picture as one of the reference images for the model. This is the front view. They usually will have a front view and a side view. It's nice and handy, I think, to work with the front view when doing this sort of thing. So what we're going to do from here is we're going to try and turn this into a nice usable icon in this sort of format that's going to look real cute inside of our shop. We're going to be using all of the default brushes that come with Photoshop. This is included as it is installed, so we're not going to be using anything that you guys aren't going to have. First things first, I've got my reference image here, which is my first layer inside my mask folder. I'm going to come down and I'm going to add a new layer because we're going to start out by making a sketch. So I'm going to hit this plus icon with a little square in it. I'm going to turn this layer off for a minute, just toggle it using the eyeball next to it. And I'm going to go ahead and change my brush settings real quick here. So what I usually like for sketching, and I favor for most of this tutorial, out of the general brushes, I prefer this hard round pressure size brush. It's just a very dynamic and convenient brush to use. It's very pretty with the pressure sensitivity, so it'll respond really well to how hard you're pressing, and it looks nice and smooth. I'm going to come up to opacity and lower that to about 33%. Anywhere from 30 to 50 works. It's just nice to have semi-transparent lines when you're sketching, I find, because you'll find you like to kind of go over the same area a lot like that. So I've got my new layer over here for sketching. I'm going to double click on the name, layer 4, and I'm going to type in sketch, because that is just a nice organizational thing that I like to do. It's a good habit to get into naming your layers, especially in a project like this, because we're going to have quite a few layers by the end of it. So we've got our sketch layer, and we're going to go ahead and get started with the actual sketch. So what I'm going to do first is I'm just going to draw a big circle. And it's going to be probably pretty dang ugly because I'm not too concerned about this circle in particular. But all of our masks are primarily circular shaped. That might change depending on the designs that happen in your class, but a lot of the designs are going to be circular. So I'm going to go ahead and just start with a big, messy circle. And one thing I want to do real quick for my reference, I want to make sure that it's about the same size as the boy's head so that I'm working kind of a similar size range here. So I turned on the boy just so I can see it. And you guys will kind of have to eyeball it, make sure it's kind of fitting in the canvas as a similar size to mine. But I'm going to right click on this sketch layer somewhere out here on the canvas and hit the free transform as I did. And then I'm just going to pull these corners to resize it. And it fits pretty nicely just about there. So you guys will have to eyeball it. Probably put your circle about this big at this position in the canvas. And it's pretty ugly right now because I'm not really going to use it all that studiously. It's just a guideline for me. What I usually like to do from here, if you'll notice, our boy is not a perfect circle. He's got a little bit of shape to his face. So that's the next thing I'm going to do. I'm going to add a bit of personality to her face here. And looking back at our reference image, she's got a bit rounder face. So I think I'm going to come down with the side of her face over here. And I'm going to round it out pretty well. And I think I'm going to have her under jawline kind of divot upwards just a little bit. And I'll come and do that on the other side as well. I alternate between the eraser tool and this paintbrush tool here while I'm drawing. Just trying to get a shape that I like as I work. And you'll see I draw a lot of messy lines. I come in, I erase some just to see if I'm liking the shape so far. And I think I'm getting pretty close to something that I like. So I'm going to stop here. The next thing I'll draw, if you'll notice, I'm keeping her style pretty consistent with the boy graphic that I already drew. And that's something we'll have you guys do too. Try and keep it in the same stylistic ballpark. They're not going to look the same, of course. We've got a bunch of different artists working on this project. But this tutorial will kind of help you. This style is what we're going for, this little cutesy style here. So I'm going to put her ear off to the side of her head. A lot of these masks are not going to be humanoid like these. I know we've got like a dragon and a dog and stuff like that, so I understand that this could get pretty variable working in the sketching phase. So don't be too concerned on all the details while you sketch. Just make sure it looks like the reference image and make sure you're kind of trying to adapt it to this kind of cutesy style. So I've got her ear in there. The next thing I'm going to do, because I want to start drawing features, is I'm going to draw some guidelines. This is a little different too. It might depend on your mask, but I think if you're drawing anything with a face, it's handy to put that front line down there. And usually eyes are going to be, on most things with the face are going to have eyes in the same place. So you want to draw your middle face line and your eye line here. Those are just markers for me, basically to place all of my elements. They're not going to be inked or anything like that. We're going to draw some eyes on this, and if you'll notice, the boy's eyes that I have here are just big circles, because that's kind of what they look like on the masks, right? They're just kind of those circular eyes. I draw them a little bit smaller and a little bit more ovular and a little more shapely, so it's just to kind of make it look cute. Right now, it's probably going to look kind of creepy. They just look like big voids, but we'll get around to making these look all cutesy once we've got all of our ink and coloring in. For now, I just kind of want them in the general location and size that I'm going to prefer. Looking back at our reference image, the nose is a bit higher on the head than the boy's, so I'm going to put it up here. It looks kind of cute. I might move it down in a minute or two. And my guidelines are starting to get in the way, so I'm going to take my eraser and just get rid of some of these so that I can see. This big circle that we drew at first was just for us to get our basic shape. It's not for anything too important, so you can go ahead and erase that if it's bothering you. I'm going to go ahead and draw in a cute little smile for our girl. And I like that. I think I'm going to shift the nose down just a bit. So I'm going to come up here, because I'm too lazy to draw another one, because I like that little circle I drew. And I'm going to select this third tool down as the lasso tool. You can just click and drag around a shape, and it will make a selection. And then if you go back to this first tool up top, the move tool, you can drag things wherever you'd like. And I like it right there, so that's where I'm going to put it. Make sure if you haven't yet, come up to File and hit Save or Save As, and save it as something you're going to recognize, and then periodically throughout this process be hitting the Save key. Control S, for those of you who don't know. So I've got those features in here. Let's see what else we've got. So, for her eyebrows, they seem kind of like a parentheses shape, but just, a lot thicker. So that's what I'm going to start with. I'm going to start with a nice parentheses shape right here, and then I'm going to round off the edges. And I'm going to draw a shape that looks like that. Looks how I want it to. And I'm liking how that's looking. So I'm going to try and emulate kind of that similar shape over on this side. Just with a bit of perspective because we are at an angle here. And before I go on, one thing that I did think about while saying that, our masks are all going to be at this 3/4 view. Usually when you draw reference images, you can draw them from the front and the side. Those are the two typical images you'll have. Ours, we like to draw the icons at this 3/4 view. It gives a bit more visual interest. And I would ask, I think everybody's are going to face to the left. So I guess the icons are right. So have them tilted in this direction, in this orientation. Turning my sketch back on. I got the eyebrows how I wanted them. I like those quite a bit. So now I'm going to move on to the hair, which is another pretty big part of this. So just looking at it, it looks like she's got bangs that kind of fringe out to the side. She's got little hair swoopies that come into the sides of her face. And then big old ponytails connected by these beads. So I'm going to work on drawing that. I'm going to start with the shape that I think will be most foundational. I think that'll be the bangs. So I'm going to start, me personally, I like starting with just the back of the hairline up here. And I'm going to come up and around kind of on both sides here, give them some shape. And when I hit a point where I feel the bangs should kind of start falling, I'm going to put them there. And I'm drawing some rough clumps of hair. You'll notice I'm drawing them kind of rounded on the edges. That's a similar style to this graphic I had here. If your graphic has hair, this is probably a good way to go about it. It will fit the same style to have them round off at the ends. And I think it's pretty cute. You don't necessarily have to if you think you've got something better, but trying to stick with a consistent style is going to work nicely with those rounded hair edges. From there, I'll draw these little hair swoopies. And I'm going to have this one come down right about here. That's cute. I like this design. Finn did a good job. And this one, since we're at an angle, it's also going to kind of swoop forward a bit. You'll see it poking out over here on the end. And last but not least, we've got the ponytails. So the beads are going to be near the top of her head. Since we're at an angle, yet again, these beads will probably be a little more visible, while these ones will be tucked behind the other side of her head. And from that, our ponytails are going to emerge. Hers look like they are behind all of the other hair, so I'm going to try and keep it that way. So one thing you'll notice is I'm kind of going outside the lines. You're going to want to keep everything inside the boundaries of this box. Her ponytails are just a little big, so I'm going to need to adjust for that in a minute or two, but you do want to keep every single line inside of the box, otherwise things are going to get cut off and it's going to look a little funky. Alright, I'm just kind of making sure she's the same size as the boy, and I'm scooting her around just so all of her hair fits. And I think I got all the key details, so I'm pretty happy with my sketch. I zoom out to kind of take a closer look at it. I might adjust the eyes when I do the inking, but that'll be on the next step. So after we've got our sketch layer done here, what we're going to do is we're going to want it to be a little more transparent so that we can essentially trace over it more cleanly with ink, which will just be a black pen. So how we're going to do that is we're going to have our sketch layer selected. We're going to come up to opacity. You'll see it's probably at 100%. And we're going to want to set that somewhere around probably 30 to 40 to, 30 to 50. So now you see it has turned this pretty transparent. And it'll be a lot easier to take a black pen over on a separate layer. One thing we want to do so we make sure we're not drawing on the same layer, because that is an absolutely devastating thing to realize that you have been inking on your sketch layer. We're going to hit this lock button right here. If you see the lock category, it's going to be the last option, this fifth one. This looks like the little padlock. And now you'll see if I try and come and draw on this canvas, I'm not going to be able to now because I just locked it. So what we're going to do now for our ink layer is we are going to add another down here at the bottom. We're going to double click the name and we're going to type in ink. So for the ink right now, it's a little bit of an interesting process that I like to take, but we're just going to ink the whole thing in black right now. So the settings I like to use size 10 on this hard round pressure size brush. This is probably the most important step to copy my settings on because the line art needs to look like the same size. And I'm going to make sure my opacity is back up to 100%, so now I've got some solid black lines. One thing people find a little bit difficult is getting these like really smooth, straight lines where they're intended to be, especially if they're first starting out with working with a drawing tablet. So one thing you can actually do for that is you can come up to this smoothing feature up top, and you can move that up a bit. I usually don't like to put mine above 34 while I'm inking because I like to maintain a lot of control. But for those of you who are newer to this, you'll probably want to move it up higher. It's pretty convenient. So all I'm going to do here with my inking is I'm just going to start inking out the shapes. I want it to be pretty clean, so anything that overhangs, I'll take the eraser and fine tune. I'm going to go over all important lines that I have here, not including guidelines. Those were just there for my reference while sketching. Don't worry about those. And I drew a nice oval, but I don't think the size is quite right, so I'm going to go ahead and hit this tool, my lasso tool, circular select it, go back to my second tool, which is just your rectangular select, right click, hit free transform, and then slide it to your leisure. Alright, I like those sizes right there. So I'll just give you guys a little reel of me working on the inking for this. Some of these lines I have here are a little bit bumpy. So what I'll do is I'll take my paintbrush tool and I'll kind of fill in a little bit and then erase. I'll shave away like some erasings on the outside of it. Feel free also to do some correcting if you realize there's things you don't like about your sketches. I didn't like the shape of the ear, so I changed to that here. You want to make sure that all your lines are clean and connected. You don't really want offhangs unless they're intended to be here, like right here. But you just want to make sure that they're clean and that the line weight is similar throughout the entire inking process. So once I'm finished and I think I've got all the important lines and I think it's in a place that I like, I'm going to Control minus or go up to the view and zoom out. And I'm going to turn off my sketch layer by toggling the little eyeball and just make sure it looks how I want it. There are a couple things that I might move around by using my lasso tool yet again and then switching to the move tool. Like, I don't like the placement of this eye, and I might actually change the placement of the other one a little bit, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. But once it's at a place you like and you don't see any more flaws, like I just saw, you'll be ready to move on to the next step. Alrighty, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to start coloring with all of our flat colors. So we're going to lock our inking layer, and we're going to keep it up top. It's going to be on top of all the other layers. So I'm going to come to the layer beneath it and hit to add a new one. And I like to put every single color on a different layer. I know some people do it differently, but it's easier if you want to change that color in the future. You can just change that entire layer's color without having to worry about changing any of the other colors. So I'm going to start with the skin. That is usually a nice big area that I typically start with. I'm going to go back to our paintbrush tool, and you can kind of set the size to your leisure at this point. It's not as important. It's just whatever you're comfortable with. I'm going to turn back on our reference image, and I'm going to come to the 6th, 7th tool down and select our eyedropper tool. And then I'm going to click on this color on this girl's skin to get her skin color for her face. I'm just going to start outlining all sides of her. Anything that's going to be skin, you want to have it outlined. One thing that people will do commonly is wonder why you can't just use the paint bucket. And I'll show you and explain after I finish the outline here. You want to make sure you draw all the way to the black lines. Now we're going to take our paint bucket tool. So that's way down here in the middle of our tools. It might not look like this. I know some Photoshops come default installed with the gradient tool, which is this one right here. What you want to do to get the paint bucket is you want to click and hold on it, and then you'll have 3 different options here, and you can select our paint bucket tool. We're going to take that and we're going to click on an area in the white space in what we've just colored, and you'll notice it didn't completely fill it in. We have this weird white outline here. And that is the reason we can't just paint bucket this to begin with. We can't just paint bucket on our ink layer. The brush we are using, if you'll notice, has some semi-transparent pixels on the edges. That's what gives it its smooth look, because some of the pixels are not completely transparent or are not completely opaque. So when you use the paint bucket tool, it sees those as already filled with a color, even though they're only semi-transparent, and leaves this big line here. If you were to just use the paint bucket tool on your inking layer, direct inking layer, it would fill it in a similar way, but those lines, those white fuzzy lines would be up against the inking layer. And then it'd be a big mess because all that's on the same layer, your black ink and then your color. So I've got the skin filled in here. I'm going to lock that layer. I'm going to add another. And I'm going to go with the next biggest area that'll be convenient. I'm just going to do the hair. I'll turn this image on, grab the color, and start filling that in real quick. If you have an overcorrection, like you go over the line, just take your eraser tool and shave it off a little bit. So I'm filling in the hair here, and you'll notice that I filled in a layer or an area that wasn't supposed to be, and I also didn't fill in an area that was supposed to be. This is something you can just come back and correct. I just filled in that area manually with the brush. And this other area, these beads up here that I filled in and they're not supposed to be, I'm going to have another layer on top of them that'll fill those in, so it's not really a big concern to me. You may notice as you're going through here, you accidentally didn't fill everything in. Like, you'll hit your paint bucket, you'll click on the canvas, and then it will turn everything the color you were trying to fill. You must have just missed an area. You gotta make sure it's completely enclosed on all sides. Not a single pixel can be between them. I'm gonna put the beads, eyes, and nose all on the same layer, just because they're all separate and they're all pretty small, so they're not a huge deal to me. And I'm going to, real quick, I'm gonna grab this and I'm gonna move it down just so I can see it again. I grabbed that orange down there from the reference image, and on this new layer, I'm just going to fill these in. Anytime I went out of the lines, I'll take my eraser, shave it off. Then I'm going to take her eye color, fill that one in. And lastly, the nose color, which I'll grab right here and fill that in. So, we've got all the flat colors down, and it looks a lot less creepy, even though it's still a little bit creepy. But there's a couple things that we have to do that are different on this mask that need to still happen. So one of those, if you'll notice, with this first mask, is that the ink is not black for this character. The ink is actually different colors that are darker versions of whatever was filled in those lines. So you'll notice here the skin is a darker version of this orangish brown that we use to color the skin. And the eyes are a darker blue than the eye color. So to do that, we're going to go back to our ink layer. So make sure everything is locked except that ink layer, which you can now unlock. And we're going to do something a little special to it, because we want to make sure all these lines are not solid black lines, but nice pretty colors that match whatever is inside the fill color. So to do that, because it'd be really stupid if I had to go over all these lines again, you'd be like, Jamie, what are you doing to me? We're going to come over to our ink layer, make sure it's selected and unlocked, and we're going to hit this first option by our lock options here. It looks like the little white and gray grid. And that's going to lock to selected drawn pixels only. So what that means is, say I'll just choose an outlandish color like this crazy blue. When I try and draw on this layer, it only draws on where we've already put pixels, where there's already pixels that are colored in. So it's only going to draw on our ink. So to take care of this now, to make sure everything is the right color, we can actually come in, choose our colors, and then just fill in the ink for that area specifically. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to select the skin color with the eyedropper, and I'm going to make it a darker version of whatever this color is here in the color picker. I'm going to come down like here. Now let's see what that looks like. Alright, that's pretty nice. That's pretty nice. I'm going to do a little bit darker. Doesn't look much darker, does it? There we go. That is the color that I think I'm going to go with for all of these face lines. You know what? I changed my mind yet again. We're going even darker. There we go. So we're going to color in all the areas here that are for the face lines with this brown. And you'll see it starts to bleed onto the other areas that I've got going here. And that'll be something we can come back and fix. I just, I'm a little messy with it since I'm just doing the skin right now. I'll come in and I'll do the eyes, so I'll select the eye color, and then I'll come down to a darker version of whatever this color was. Even a little bit darker than that. You don't want it to be too similar. You still want people to be able to tell that there's line art of some kind there. I'll come to these little orange doodads here. I'm saving the hair for last because it's going to take the longest. Even darker. And I'm not being too careful about it. I'm going over the edges into the hairlines quite a bit. And that's because I saved the hair for last. So we can select the hair color now. Go to a slightly darker color, but I don't want to go too far because I don't want it to be black. That's pretty nice. I like that. Yeah, we'll go right here. Yeah, that's nice. So now I can come in with this color and fill in all the hair. And since that was the last one, as we get to these areas that we overcorrected on, you can just slowly and gently color them in with our new color. And you might have to go back and forth because they might bleed into each other just a little bit. But all in all, it's not too lengthy of a method. So I'm just going to go around and make sure all of the hairlines are colored with this new color. We're avoiding solid black lines of any kind if they're not a direct part of your character's color. Our app is pretty pastel and light colored at this point in time. If you've seen screenshots that have been demonstrated, you can tell that it's pretty light, and we're trying to keep it that way, so we're trying to avoid any solid black line art. And then you can also come in and make the eyebrows outlined in that same color because the hair and the eyebrows are like the same color. You know what I mean. It takes a bit of precision. It takes a lot of back and forth sometimes, switching between colors, making sure that you've got the right ones in the right spots. But you'll eventually hit this point, and you'll notice a couple small things. It's really hard to tell, and you might not be able to tell on the video. I don't know if the quality's good enough. But there are these little holes in certain areas, like at the top of this bead here, where I'm going to go back to the bead layer and select that orange color and just make sure I fill this in all the way to the ink. We want to make sure there's no holes in our graphic design here. It'll look kind of funky if you try and do it that way. And once you think you've filled all the holes that were revealed by changing the inking colors, we are getting a lot closer. This looks pretty nice. We're getting a lot less creepy. So now what we're going to work on is a bit weird. You have to bear with me for this one. We're going to do some shading. So to do some shading, we're going to use another layer, still underneath our ink, which I'm going to lock up entirely again. But we're going to add another layer here. I'm going to call it shading. And what we're going to do, if we look at my boy mask here, he's got some nice gradient shading on like the bottom of his chin, in his ear, and at the bottom of his hair as it fades down. So what we're going to do with that is we're going to do it kind of manually to give it this nice look. And he has inside his eyes as well, I neglected to mention. So back to our mask on our shading layer, we're going to start with shading the face. You're going to want to put shadows, and they're going to be very subtle, but you're going to want to put subtle shadows everywhere there's going to be a bit of a rounded depth to this model if it were in a 3D space. So I'm going to take a darker color than the skin, not quite as dark as the ink. but a darker color from the skin. And you want to make sure that it's still in that kind of same color family. So yeah, that's a little closer. Might not even need it too dark. That might be a good place to put it. And what we're going to do, it's going to look a little silly for a little bit until we actually fix it. So we're going to fill in some solid shapes on the undersides of where there may be some curve on this image, on the face, hair, and eyes. So we'll start with the face here. And I think there's going to be a curve on this area of the face. So I'm filling in a solid shape here. You'll see it fits the shape of the face a little weirdly, and it's going to look really weird until we do stuff with it. But I always like to leave a nice line from the edge, from the lining here. So I've got this little bit of space, if I come down, this little bit of space right here between the lining and this shading color. But we're going to make this shape on the side of her face, comes up this way a bit. And I'd be more concerned about the side that's facing the lining because that's going to be solid, but you'll see what we're going to do to the other side here. So make it kind of thick. You can make the top side of it pretty messy. It doesn't need to be super clean. Because what we're going to do now is we're going to swap from our paintbrush tool to our eraser tool. But instead of using this setting we've been using with the hard round pressure size, we're going to switch down to soft round pressure opacity. And I'm going to bump up the size a bit. And I'm going to turn the opacity down to about 30. And then I'm just going to come in and just make tons. Okay, opacity up to like 46. Tons of little strokes on the upper side of this here. And you'll notice that this hard line is starting to disappear because I am erasing it away piece by piece with a low opacity with this new brush setting. I'm erasing this top line away, so now it looks like there's this nice, pretty, smooth gradient going from her chin up to her face. So it's just going to take stroke after stroke. It might be a bit tedious. Slowly chiseling away this top line. You don't want to go too far down to it. You want to keep that bottom line solid. It gives it a nice look to just have the top line and gradient. But you want to make sure that that top line disappears. So it looks like that after we've erased some of it. So another area I think would be good to put some shading like this is over here in the ear. I'm going to turn the size down just a tad for this purpose. And on the underside of it, I'm just going to do our weird solid shape that looks silly until we shade it. I'm going to have it come up quite a bit to like here. And then I'm going to fill it in because we're going to erase a lot of it away. Come back to my eraser and start getting rid of this top line. Just erasing my way into the shape. I'm sure you guys can see it, right? You're starting to see this happening. It just gives it that nice, smooth gradient look, and I think it's rather satisfying. I like it a lot. That's all I tend to do on the skin. The shadows, you can keep them pretty light, and you can keep them pretty subtle, and you don't have to do too many of them. It can get a little bombarding, because we have quite a simple art style if you do too many. So that's where I'm going to stop for the skin. So now what I'm going to go to do is the eyes. So I'm going to work my way up. I'm going to select the eye color, come down to something darker. That looks good to me. And I'm going to fill in the bottom half of the eyes here, still leaving that ring around the ink and the base color. Alright, so now we've got these shapes. We'll take our eraser and just start erasing down into it. There we go. So now we've got a nice pretty gradient inside the eyes. The last place we're going to do it is the hair, and this is going to be the most time consuming. Something I'm actually going to do because it's really dark already. I'm going to turn the color just a little bit lighter. So I'm going to come to our hair layer, and this is why it's nice and handy to have one layer separate from the rest. I'm going to eyedrop the hair layer. I'm going to bring my brush size real big, and I'm going to make sure that it is locked to this first setting that we had while we were doing the inking. So that if I color on it, I'm only going to color on the hair. See, you can tell that I'm just coloring on hair here. I'm going to select the hair color, and I want it to be a tad bit lighter. So I'm going to move it up, and I'm going to pick something that I think fits. I don't want it to deviate too far from Finn's original color scheme, because it was a very pretty color scheme. But for the sake of what we're doing here, I need to lighten it up just a bit, because I want the shading to show up nicely. So, she's got just a bit lighter hair now. I'm going to lock that layer again, head back to my shading layer. And now I'm going to complete that same shading process with this new hair color by picking something a little bit darker, making sure it looks how I want. And this one's going to take the longest of all the shapes you've got on here because you've got all these little clumps of hair to fill in. So I'm going to probably speed that up for you guys. Alright, so now I finally got all that where I wanted. I'm going to go ahead and start erasing. Alright, so I've got all of those where I think I want them, and while I was drawing I decided there was one more area that I wanted to have these decal, this kind of shading, and I think it'd be nice on the beads. So I'm going to go up and I'm just going to put some shading in the beads here. Next up is the highlights. So you'll notice back here on our boy mask that I keep referencing, we've got our dark areas here on the edge of the hair, but we've also got a couple light areas, like up here on the top of his hairline and on the tip of his nose. So we're going to add some highlights, which are going to be the opposite of shading. We're going to make a new layer, name it highlights. And for this, we're going to use the same technique, but we're going to go from the top down rather, like the light is shining from the top. So I'm actually going to start with the hair highlight this time around. Make sure it's a good color. We want it to be lighter. And highlights, you'll find you want them to be a lot subtler because they show up a lot more vividly because they're so much lighter. So we're going to erase quite a bit of this down. I'm going to put up a highlight right up here. And then also put a highlight on the ponytail, I think. Top of the ponytail. You don't want to put as many highlights in as many places as you put your shading. Try and keep them pretty minimal. And the last area, I'm going to put a highlight. Actually, I have 2 more areas I'm going to put highlights. I'm going to put one on the nose. So I'm going to select this nose color. Make it a little lighter. This one's going to be pretty small, pretty cute. And I'm also going to put highlights on the beads. It'll give them a bit of a shiny quality. Alright, so now we're really close. There's just a couple things that we still need to do. So I'm going to add one more layer. I'm going to just call this one Decal, because we just need to add a couple little embellishments. One of the things that we can do is we can actually add some opaque highlights. So we're going to come up to our brush here, our normal brush, and we're going to add some highlights that we aren't going to gradient shade like that. So I have an example here on the boy. He's got some in his eyes here with these dots, and these on his hair. So we're going to add these to similar places. I selected the highlight color that I was using for the hair, and I'm going to just make some opaque highlights that are pretty rounded because her hair is a rounded shape. And I'm going to just add those there. They do give it a bit more of a shiny quality. And I think I'm just going to keep them there. I like them right there. Get them a nice shade that you shape that you want. The closer they are to the original highlight, this big line we've got here, the bigger they're going to be. And then we're going to come down to the eye, select it with the eyedropper, and come up to a random highlight color that we feel fits. I'm going to go a little lighter than that. That's a little too light. I'm just going to make 2 little highlight dots, like there's some light shining on her eyes. And last but not least, there's one more element of Decal that we are going to add. If we look back at our reference image here, who is hiding in the corner, she has some little cheek blushes. So I'm going to select those. This is going to be optional depending on your design. But I'm going to come up to our brushes, and for this one, I'm going to use the soft round pressure opacity setting and turn it up pretty big and turn its opacity pretty far down. And I'm just going to come and gently airbrush on here some pink highlights for her little blush. Just with a few different strokes, you're going to come airbrush them on here. It bled into the eyes a little bit, so I'm going to make sure that I clean that up with a fully opaque brush. And into the hair. You don't want it to pollute the other colors. You kind of want it to stay where it's at. But turning your brush so big means it's probably going to get in other places, so you just need to be mindful of that. So I cleaned that up, and that is actually just about all we have to do. So you're about done. There are a couple things that I do to make sure everything is in order and the mask is clean. One of those things is this is a little bit of a weird optional one, but I always have a layer down there with just a solid weird color that isn't in my graphic anywhere. So I can see if I went outside the lines anywhere, and it looks like I didn't too bad, just one little teensy spot by the side of the hair. And I cleaned up there. It's just to keep an eye on making sure you're staying within your lines. Another thing that I'll do, and this is optional as well, but I find it's pretty helpful, I'll add a solid copy of this image underneath it. So what this is going to look like is I'm going to select every single layer that I've got, and then I'm just going to fill that in on a new layer down here. So this is optional, so I'm going to run through it pretty quick, but I added a new layer called Black Image, where I'm just going to fill it in with a black paint bucket. So to select all of the layers at once, I'm going to hit Control, I'm going to hold it and hit Shift, and I'm going to click on the thumbnail of each of these little layers, the little picture down next to it. So I clicked on every single layer. As you'll notice, it highlighted the entire girl, and just to make sure there's no holes in it, I will fill that in. And you can't even see it because it's behind everything, but if I get rid of everything here, you'll see there's this black image of the girl, and there's some holes in it. So I'm going to come through with this, and I'm just going to fill in the holes to make sure the image is completely opaque. It's not going to look any different once you fill in the girl, because they're such small little areas, but it's nice to have a solid graphic by the time you're done. So there you go. One thing that we need to do to export it correctly is we got to make sure our background layers are turned off. It doesn't matter what color you had in the back. You need this white and gray checkered pattern before you export it. So now that I've made sure that's showing, I made sure nothing bled out of the edges, we're going to come up here to File, Export, Quick Export as PNG. You want to make sure this is a PNG. And I'm going to put it with the boy icon here. I'm going to call it girl icon. You save yours wherever you need to turn it into us. And then I'm going to hit save. So that should quickly extract your image as a PNG. Make sure you've got it as a PNG. And that'll be your completed icon. Once you get it to us, we'll implement it in our app, and you'll see it moving around in the shop.